So welcome everybody. Good morning in the Americas, very early good morning. Good afternoon in Europe, MENA and Africa, and good evening in Asia and Oceania. Welcome at the Atelier for Solidarity, organized by the Festival Academy, which is an initiative of the European Festivals Association. We are at day 2 of our Atelier, and it seems already like we did 7 days. Behind me, you can see clocks hanging with the different time zones. I looked this morning, we started at 5:30 a.m. Brussels time, which was the morning for Asia, Oceania. And if I look in the calendar, the program ends today at 3:30 a.m. Brussels time, so that's almost 18 hours. We will not follow everything, but still, it's a very interesting process. The Atelier for Solidarity was set up in response to the COVID-19 crisis to bring festival managers, artists, curators, and people from social movements, foundations, or arts councils together to reimagine our future together. We have 65 direct participants from more than 40 countries and some 10 mentors who are guiding this process. In the next days, we will have 7 keynotes coming from all different continents who will inspire our thinking and our process for the conversations that we are having in our different time zones or in global plenary sessions. Today, I'm very delighted to announce Moky Makura, who is the Executive Director of Africa No Filter. Africa No Filter is an organization that supports the development of nuanced and contemporary stories that shift stereotypical and harmful narratives within and about Africa. So delighted to have you with us, Moky Makura. The conversation will be facilitated by Mike van Graan. So I'll give the floor to you both.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Inga. And as Inga has mentioned, this will not be so much a keynote address as much as a keynote conversation. So I'm delighted to welcome Moky Makura to our conversation. And how this will go is that, well, basically I'll ask a few questions. Moky will kind of respond. If she wants to ask questions, she may do that as well. And then after about half an hour or so, we'll open it up to you as participants to ask questions as well. So, you know, the backdrop for this is that obviously, as Inga was saying, the role of Africa No Filter is about shifting narratives about Africa, harmful, stereotypical narratives about Africa. We are a gathering of festival managers, and festivals themselves are all about narratives. They provide platforms for people to be able to tell stories. But festivals are also narratives in themselves because they tell stories in terms of who owns them, who funds them, who curates them, and for whom. So that's basically the backdrop for our discussion around narratives today and who makes those narratives and for whom. So Moky, I wonder if we could maybe just start off by your telling us a little bit more about Africa No Filter, which is a recent organization, and why you think it's necessary for an organization like this today.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. I can see some nice videos, so it's good to see that rather than just names and the mute sign. But yeah, thanks for that introduction. So Africa No Filter, it's a fairly new organization in that it started off as a project under the Ford Foundation. And I think both Inga and Mike, you've talked about our objective, our goal, which is to try and shift sort of harmful, stereotypical narratives about the continent, which we all know about. I think that what makes the work, or what we're trying to do with the organization, because I don't think it has been done, is that there are a number of organizations, institutions, individuals who are doing this. You know, a lot of people who often say we need to change the African narrative, but I don't think any organization is trying to bring that ecosystem together, that sort of group of people trying to do this work together. So that's one of the big goals of Africa No Filter. Trying to identify who is doing this, and sometimes it could just be an individual who just gets very concerned and just responds on email to organizations that are actually set up to do this work to make sure that we represent Africa more, in a more balanced way on the global platforms and to ourselves. So, because this is not just narratives about Africa. Yeah, so that's what we're trying to do. We've got some great funding, from Ford Foundation, Open Society, Bloomberg, Illuminate. So yeah, we've got a good platform from which to build this, but it is still quite new. So we're looking to figure out who wants to join this movement to actually, just be a more coordinated approach to narrative change.
So at one level, the idea of changing the narrative is quite an easy one to understand. It's that the more negative and stereotypical the view of Africa and of Africans, the more negative Africa and Africans will be viewed within the world. But also, the more these stereotypes are kind of perpetuated, the more Africans themselves, ourselves, will internalize these stereotypes. And so we will be disempowered or disempower ourselves because we will begin to believe the kinds of things that are said about us or the ways in which we are viewed by the rest of the world. But it's a little bit more complex than that, in that where does changing the narrative and spin kind of begin and end? Because this is something that you've written about in your recent article, Moky, for CNN, where you write that Black people may not be dying in Africa as a result of racism, but too many are dying because of their ethnicity, their political views, their poverty, and their gender. So this is within Africa, and that's the lived experience of many people. So that's not a stereotype or a harmful view of Africa. That's the lived experience which you articulate as well. And if that's the lived experience of many people, what does changing the narrative mean in that context? And how do artists, by changing the narrative to be a more positive one, not become co-opted praise singers or defenders of despotic regimes that may be responsible for the violence of poverty or the violence committed against the LGBTIQI community, for example?
I think one of the things that I do need to be clear about is that the work we're doing is not to present one very positive image or story or narrative about the continent. We're not, because that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to say is there are a multiplicity of different storylines, different narratives about the continent. So, it's not about saying we don't have bad leaders. We do have bad leaders on the continent, but we have equally more good leaders. But if the narrative about us becomes that Africa is full of bad leadership, then that's negative. Just to take your point about the ethnicity, I mean, if you look at countries like South Africa has this rare phenomenon called xenophobia. When I say rare, on the African continent, it's the only one that I know that it has experienced these sort of peaks of absolute violence against other Africans, other Black Africans specifically. And that's as a result, I believe, of what they believe about other Africans. There's a sense of othering. These narratives give us a sense of otherings. It's not us, it's them. And I think the outcome of that, you can see there's violence and, just the way people feel they've been treated. I also, in another piece, wrote about the experience of these African students and traders who were in China. I think, I don't know how to pronounce it, Guangzhou province in China, a lot of African traders there who go and buy there because it's sort of the manufacturing center of China. And when the their COVID response started, they started, throwing these Africans out of hotels. They weren't allowed into supermarkets. Their landlords would boot them out of their properties. The whole thing was because somehow Africans brought COVID to China. I mean, the irony in that statement, because we know where this virus started, is it was based on the stories and the narrative about Africans in China. And that's what I'm saying, that there are implications, there are very deep implications for what we put out there. And I think for this particular group, what I'm keen to do is to say that there are multiple stories about the continent, but we as Africans need to make sure that we put out other ones, not the ones that are already out there, because there's a lot of people doing that already. There's, the stories of us, poverty, the stories of us poor leadership, stories of us just violent, there's a lot of violence on the continent. All of those things already out there. Who is representing the other stories? And, how do we make sure that we put out not necessarily positive narratives, because I feel that feels like a bit of a whitewash and a sort of, Africa is all good, but just other narratives that just represent us as a continent. And I just wanted to say one thing. We did some literature reviews just recently, just looking at what was written about narrative. And one of the things that came out of these, a lot of academic papers, was that in 2019, the most popular talked about country on Twitter was Wakanda. Wakanda is a fictional country that doesn't exist. It was talked about, and this was a year after the film came out, and it was talked about more than Kenya, than I think it was Egypt and South Africa. And that sort of data point just makes me think about two things. One is that people don't know that there are 54, possibly 55 countries on the continent, that they think Wakanda is actually one of them. And the fact that, popular fiction, something that appeared in a film, was so powerful that it led people to talk about it more than it actually talked about various countries on the continent, means that popular fiction actually, or popular culture, is a powerful platform for changing narrative. Those are the two things that I just wanted to say, that it's not just, the stories we put out there, it's also the fiction that we put out there about the continent.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think the point you make about there being different stories, that it's not just one narrative, even with not just about the continent, but even within each of our countries, there are different stories to be told, different narratives. And just on your theme of Afrophobia, which is what some of us refer to it in South Africa, the xenophobic violence against people from other parts of the continent, provides a bit of a segue into my next question. In the article, you also write, what happens when Black people are both victims and perpetrators? Do Black lives matter much then? And so what I wanted to ask was, if Africa No Filter changes the narrative, which is how we understand the story or the projection of the story, who changes the substance of what that narrative seeks to reflect? And I ask this because in many ways, we as artists talk about our work reflecting our societies. So in a way, we are not engaged necessarily in changing our societies, we're simply reflecting it. And we talk about our festivals being symptoms of or reflecting those stories by virtue of giving platforms to the stories of artists. But who actually engages in shifting the substance of what is happening on our continent, in our countries, and what is the association of Africa No Filter with those forces?
Look, I mean, I think it's a great question, because I feel you're right. The role of artists is to represent the societies they're in, right? In some cases, or it's to create fictionalized ideas of what their society could be. And I think what we're saying is that there are lots of different ways to tackle this. And I don't think Africa No Filter is saying that, well, one of the things we are going to do is invest in and support, storytellers to do this work, as in to be more, to represent the other side that's not as well told. But I think there's, a huge number of social, justice organizations, social change organizations that are working in their own spaces to do this. We know that ultimately, narratives are just, a series of stories that people hear on and on and again, on numerous times, that lead them to a particular narrative. And I think you can tell a story in lots of different ways, and your framing of your story is also what's important. So I can tell a story about, a lesbian couple, but I frame it in a way that's negative, which leads to a negative narrative. Or I can tell a story about that same, lesbian couple, but I tell it with a positive framing. So again, I think that there are people who are fighting for LGBTQI rights, and that will continue to go, because you need to change society fundamentally. But as storytellers, there's a lot we can do to frame how people see that particular community. So I guess that's how I see it. We are not doing this on our own. I think there's an ecosystem of people that need to get involved, changing it, actually at a societal level, and then how we as artists represent it.
That's great. And over the last number of ateliers, we've been looking at what the role of festivals is, or should be, or could be within our respective societies. So as opposed to these festivals only being symptoms of our societies and what is happening there, can there be forces for good? Can there be forces for change? Can they contribute towards having some kind of social impact? What is your view?
I mean, absolutely. I think, because I feel that when people are attending festivals or when they're going to just step out of their day-to-day life, they're going there to see, I guess, to be entertained, to be informed. So I think that festivals have a huge, platform to influence people, to influence how people see the world, to influence or to communicate a narrative, communicate something different. And I think that's the challenge, because we can turn on the news and see reality every day, and the thing is that news doesn't necessarily reflect all things that happen in a society. And I think that's where festivals come up, because I think, either the arts or literature or film, all of these things are just different ways of us seeing our societies. And I think festivals, depending on how you're curating it, depending on the theme that you're trying to promote, you have a powerful opportunity to influence the way your audience sees a particular issue or sees a particular, thing in society. So I find that incredibly powerful.
That's again a very good segue into my next question. A number of years ago, UNTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, issued a couple of reports into the global creative economy. And these reports basically show that Africa's share of the global creative economy amounted to less than 1%. And what that pointed to was essentially two things. On the one hand, that as a continent, we weren't really deriving as much economic benefit from our creative industries as what we might by virtue of being players in the global creative market and global creative economy. But much more importantly, the thing about creative products is that embedded within them are value systems, beliefs, ways of looking at the world. And so if we as Africans are kind of absent from that global market, we tend to be consumers of the way in which the world is viewed and constructed by others, whose creative products we imbibe as consumers of Hollywood movies, as watchers of television programs and the like. And we within the continent don't have these kinds of international platforms that have global reach to project our stories. We don't have a CNN that projects the news from our perspectives. So we know about George Floyd, the world doesn't know about Collins Coyser, and because we're not able to tell these stories. So I just wondered if you, as the African Affolter, had a vision in this regard for potential African platforms, or are we basically dependent upon the platforms that exist that are largely global North platforms to provide the basis for our storytelling?
I think a lot of people have talked about the necessity for, a global platform, something like CNN but personally, I feel that the market, as in consumers, viewers, look at what they're interested in. If Africans or the world was more interested in knowing more about Africa, CNN would cater for it. So I think the first thing is that we need to stimulate interest in ourselves, because I can tell you more, a Nigerian sitting in Lagos knows a lot more about New York, about America, than about a Nairobian or somebody who sits in Nairobi or somebody who sits in Kenya. So the thing is that between ourselves as Africans, we don't know an awful lot about each other, and we are not looking for that information. I don't think we are. And I think it needs to start with creating the need to understand that there's a need for us as Africans to actually have an interest in ourselves, rather than wanting to know what's happening in the global markets and following a movement. I mean, in that article, I actually write about the fact that I was amazed that the teenagers around me were so consumed by this Black Lives Matter, which was primarily in my eyes, an American-led campaign, and they were rooting for George Floyd, and that's fine, but we have 1,000 of them on the continent. And they didn't know about that, because this, we call it, we've been calling it cultural colonization. This, we want to know everything that's going on in America, in Britain, but we're not so keen on what's going on in our countries. I don't know that the answer to that is another platform, because on that platform, for it to be sustainable, they're going to have to cover the stories about America, you know. And I've seen multiple platforms try. People have come into the market saying, hey, we need to put on this, global, an African, an Al Jazeera for Africa, CNN for Africa. There's a reason why it doesn't work. I'm not saying we shouldn't try, but I think it actually starts with us actually understanding each other as Africans first, being interested in us, and then we'll start going to global platforms. But yeah, I mean, to your point, I actually, I think you're completely right. As Africans, we don't contribute enough to the global sort of creative output. But there are people trying, the Nollywood industry, which everybody talks about, it's just not big enough. We don't have the investment. And I think the biggest problem for us as Africans is that there is no funding. There is no funding for the creative industries. There's very little funding, full stop, for anything. But there is very little funding for you to do these, the movies, put on the festivals. You go to the same old handful of, the mobile network operator who's the only one that's got funds, but everybody that's doing anything is going to the same place. So it's a tough market. It starts with putting the right infrastructure in place so that it can be sustainable. So artists can be sustainable, creators and storytellers can be sustainable. And I think that's probably more important for me than putting out another platform to share with people, what's going on, in Africa. I think we need to do that for ourselves first.
And yet, many more people in Africa know about South Africa than what South Africans know about people in other parts of the continent. And that's largely because we have television networks that basically operate across the continent. So we as a country, I mean, we in a way are cultural imperialists across Africa. We are able to project our stories and the way we see the world as South Africans, but we don't know about what's happening in Botswana, a country right next door to us. But they are very familiar with what happens here.
Right. Well, I'll say just go pick up on that. I mean, look, I think you'd be surprised at the number of Africans that watch Nollywood films, that watch Nigerian content. So every time I go anywhere, I'm Nigerian, by the way, and people say, "Oh, you're Nigerian," and then they're like, they say a Yoruba word or they'll say an Igbo word, they'll greet me. I'm amazed because I don't know what platform they're watching it on, but they're watching it on the internet. They're watching it. They're accessing it in different ways. So we actually need to understand more about that, because that's how Hollywood sucked us into America. It was through the films. The reason why I believe that America is a superpower is because of movies like Top Gun. That just shows my age, by the way. It wasn't because I visited the military installation in the US and saw America's firepower. It was fiction. It was fiction. And I think that the role of, again, popular culture, films, literature, festivals, just this ability to even put together a fictionalized view of the continent of Africa is a powerful way of shifting narrative.
And that's why people often talk about the arts and about culture generally as being the tools of soft power. So on the one hand, people are able to use the economy and the military and so on to force people to oblige them to act in particular ways, but culture, with people imbibing the value systems and the like, they come to be ruled by their own consent, to coin a crumb-skinned term. But maybe just to move on a little bit, in terms of, again, changing the narrative and the importance of it, but one could also question, I just want to maybe go to the USA with this question. How does changing the narrative help? If you go to the USA, for 8 years, they had a Black president, incredibly articulate, great orator, sense of humor, incredibly accomplished in many ways. And in the context of slavery and racism and the marginalization of Black people in America, he represented something different. He was a symbol of something new. He was the new narrative in a way that should have affirmed the Black experience in the context of American history. And yet what follows him is a white nationalist racist, which kind of allows the conditions to emerge in which white supremacy kind of parades proudly again. And you have the George Floyds and you have all of these kinds of incidents happening again. So my question is one that I'm asking you because I'm troubled by it.
I hope I can help you.
Here we are changing the narrative in order for people's perceptions to change. And you cannot have anyone more powerful than the President of America kind of being a different kind of symbol or narrative. And yet here we are in the world, polarized racially. How does changing the narrative help if people are so ideologically committed to their supremacist kind of ways of being, and the very same impulses that drove slavery still seem to drive people's attitudes to people of color today.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think I should have probably corrected you, because I don't see African Unfiltered as a narrative change organization. I see it as one that's trying to shift the narrative. And the way we're doing that is by crowding in new, more progressive storylines. So it's difficult. I've always said to people, there's no way, there's not enough money in the world for me to change one Trump voter's opinions about the continent. There is not enough money, enough time to do that. And I don't know that I want to. There will always be people who fundamentally believe that Africans are inferior or Black people are inferior. There will always be that. But what we need to do is present to them evidence that shows that there are other stories you can tell about the continent, that there are other ways you could look at Black people, look at Africans. And that's the only way we can do it. I feel that people start off with the stories they hear, and the example I say is that, Mike, I read, say I read, 3 or 4 stories that, Mike, you've been taken to court. Then the next story I hear that you're beating up your wife. And then, the next story is that you owe money to somebody. I start thinking, my narrative about you is that, Mike's not such a good guy, and then the next time I see.
Where have you been reading these? You've been Googling me.
I'll send you the links, Mike. I mean, my narrative about you will be,
Sure.
negative. It'll be like, well, okay, Mike, I need to kind of stand clear of him. I'm not going to hang around him. I'm going to delete him from my book. He's not good people. And that informs how I behave. So I do think it starts with stories. It starts with what people hear and believe about you. And that's what we have the ability to shift. So if we start there and you start hearing and reading, hey, hold on, Africans are not all poor leaders, because look, here's an amazing, president, prime minister, of Ethiopia, president of Ghana, Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa. All these guys are good leaders. Yet the prevailing narrative is that we are incapable of good leadership, right? You've got to put these stories in. And we know also the way to change or to capture people is not to tell them the data that, out of, 54 countries, X% leaders are good. You need to tell the stories and hear the stories of those leaders. So that's, again, where storytelling and creators, the work media does, the work you festival owners do to curate this content, the artists, the storytellers that are putting in the stories, that's how we shift narrative.
I mean, it resonates very much with, my practice. I basically work as a playwright, and I have particular interests in exploring this dialectic between the individual human being and the kind of macro context in which the human being is located, and
Right.
how the human being can impact on structures and how structures kind of impact on individuality or ways of being. So this is why I'm kind of asking the questions not only about narrative storytelling, but also about the structures and the macro conditions that frame those narratives. And I wanted to, in that regard, also refer to some of the structural challenges that Africans face within the world today. So although the world kind of now projects itself as being more civilized because we no longer have slavery and the like, the way we treat people of color and so on still kind of reflects a lack of civilization in some ways. But I wanted to point to something which for me is a symbol of these structural inequalities that prevail within the world, that also impacts on our festivals and our mobility. A UNESCO report of 2 years ago showed that a European passport will get the holder to about 155 countries without needing a visa for 3 months, whereas the average African passport would get the holder to less than half of that number of countries without requiring a visa. Now, that is a structural problem. That is a structural challenge within the world today. How do we, in terms of projecting our stories, because we need to travel around the world to tell our stories, when the structures are in place that actually limit that? And in many ways, the irony is that many countries that are quite quick to point out the lack of freedom of expression in the global south and in Africa in particular, themselves impose these structural limitations on Africans coming into their countries to tell these stories, which is a form of censorship. So I wondered if you had any comments about that, the structural difficulties of projecting our new narratives into the world.
Look, I mean, I think that that data point you gave, this UNESCO thing, study about 155 countries where you can use travel to, I think is really interesting. And yes, you're right. It's not just external, it's within the continent as well. I feel that's why it's important for there to be advocacy organizations and organizations that are pushing to give artists a voice. And that's where Africans are not funding those organizations. That kind of work is often being done by, foreign funders. It's the Ford Foundation, it's Open Society that's doing that. So that's a structural change. How do we figure out how we can elevate, the voices of storytellers and give them that license to do that? And I think it starts with Africans realizing the importance of storytellers and the importance of culture, the importance of just not letting other people tell our stories. One of my favorite quotes is, "Until lions learn to write, hunters will tell their stories for them." And I think that's what we do on the continent. We could be the lions, but it turns out we're letting other people write our stories because we haven't given, the platform to storytellers to do that. But you're right, there's a lot of things that we need to change. But I do think that the challenge for us as a continent is that we've got to build our infrastructure. We've got to build the opportunities for people to be able to have the money, because it boils down to where's the funding coming from? How do we fund these initiatives? Africa just has to be more self-reliant. It has to be more self-reliant to create its own revenue streams and just be, as powerful as the US or America, the US or France or Germany. And it starts with, they're called those powerful countries because they have money. They have money. So, I mean, I'm sorry, an artist round to bring it down to money, but it really does have a lot to do with it. Yeah.
I mean, I think
in my computer.
You popped into the Africa group earlier when Mohammed from Egypt was talking about, the lack of support from government for festivals, for the sector at this time, but that in a way they don't have any option as artists but to proceed, because if they didn't, children would simply not have access to anything. And that's so they, in terms of what they are providing. And this issue of money is an interesting one, because although it is us who are telling our stories, and we need to tell our stories, as you have been suggesting, a lot of our storytelling is been funded by Europe, by the global north. Africa, no filter, exists as well because essentially of funding from abroad. So I suppose the question is, to what extent does international funding shape the way in which we tell our stories, for fear of offending funders, for fear of alienating audiences that we would want to earn euros from because our own currency is not particularly strong?
I mean, I think it goes without saying that, and it's not just in this sector, that how international financing or however things are funded really impacts the way stories are told. And it's a pity, but it's also what we need right now. It's about finding a way to make sure you don't feed the narrative beast that you are trying not to feed because you've accepted other people's funding. And I mean, this is probably quite controversial, but I'll give this example. I know that, a lot of organizations give funding to, initiatives that promote LGBTQI rights, for example. You will not get that funding from an African organization because they would be nervous to give it away, because in a lot of countries, unfortunately, it's still against the law. So, if you want to do that work, you have no other outlet than to get funding internationally. So you're going to have to take it. It gives you the platform to do what you need to do. So I just give that one example where it's needed. And I feel that until we get, organizations, foundations, social justice organizations that have the funding to do this, we're still going to have to be heavily reliant on foreign funding. And that it's not a problem. I'm only in existence because I got American US funding. But I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it, and I'm going to figure out how I use that to catalyze money from the continent. sometimes we've got to start things however we do.
Sure. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'd like to open it up to the participants to ask questions as well. I can't see everyone at the same time, so if you want to ask a question, please just let me know in the chat room, and I will then invite you to ask a question. So my final question, Moky, at this particular time in our world history and what is happening with COVID-19 and the kind of existential challenges that it's posing, the racist polarization that is happening within our world today. What for you as African, no filter, but also as an African, what for you does allyship mean? What does solidarity mean at this particular time? It's not just about money, which is what we've been speaking about. Is it something more?
Look, I think that my whole thing for African No Filter and what I'm really trying to promote is that as Africans, we actually need to come together. We need to come together we're far more powerful together than we are independently. A continent of 1.3 billion people versus a population in, say, Botswana of 2 million people. You can't compete. So I would love to see more unity, and not that sort of Pan-Africanist sort of, from when we're all getting our independence, it was in Nkrumah, it was we need to come together. A lot of those things haven't been fulfilled yet. But I feel that if we can see each other not as them, us and them on the continent, we'll be far more powerful. And that's kind of what I would love African Filter to be able to push, because the narratives we're trying to change are equally damaging for us as Africans. And it's not just about others. It's not just about, the West. I'm not so concerned about changing them. But I am concerned that their narratives, the way they write about us, we're seeing it and imbibing it on the continent. So if we close off all of that and we just look to ourselves and we figure out, how together we can be more powerful, then I think that's what would be important for me.
Great. So this is an atelier for solidarity, and solidarity kind of going beyond our respective regions, looking kind of across the global south, the global north. What does that actually mean at this particular time? So I suppose both in terms of uniting us across our continent, but also what does solidarity with Africa mean? What does solidarity between Africa and Asia and Latin America and progressives in Europe and the States mean at this particular time? Yeah, I'm just wanting your reflections on that in terms of what the theme of this particular atelier is.
Solidarity is about people sort of understanding that empathy, understanding where we all come from, and I think that's the important thing. Even though I said that we as Africans, I think we as Africans do need to come together in a way, not first, but we need to come together because there's a lot of, using and theming. But solidarity for whatever it is we're going through, just as I think that people have stood behind this Black Lives Matter, which has become a global thing. It's about injustice. It really is about injustice. And that's what I would say the solidarity is about. We as one people, it's not necessarily just Africans, and we are not the only ones suffering, but everybody can see through what we are going through. I really don't know how to answer that question, but yeah, I feel that if we all understand that we are one, then it's not about us and them. But the important thing is that because Africa is so disjointed, I see that there needs to be solidarity at home first.
Great. So there's a question from Adele from Egypt. Social media. Does social media play a part in representing alternative narratives, and to what extent?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. I mean, that's where we got that data piece on Twitter that, the most talked about, country on Twitter was a country that didn't exist, Wakanda. So yes, absolutely does. And part of our research will be looking into that to kind of understand what people are saying, because there's lots of data to show, and particularly around this COVID, that most people were getting their information on COVID from social media. It wasn't necessarily from media or traditional outlets. A lot of people are getting their views and stories about the continent coming out from social media, from conversations. So it's absolutely critical for us to know what's going on there.
Okay, I don't see anybody with further questions. I don't see any questions.
Adele put his hand up, I think, no?
Adele?
Yeah, he's waving.
Adele, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I want to elaborate a bit about this question, about the social media question. It's what I'm asking is because is it still powerful for progressive meaning or progressive values, social media, or it is now also become a huge platform for racist, for nationalist, and this polarization that we have now is very confusing somehow. Like I would like to give an example. Like yesterday, there is a young lady committed suicide, and she was a LGBT. She was a queer young lady. She committed suicide in Canada because she was arrested in Egypt, and the reflections and the reactions with this, it was somehow scary for some people, because it was a lot of people against her, a lot of people from Muslim point of view cursing her somehow. And it was shocking for me, because I thought we passed this somehow. Yes, we don't defend LGBT community, or we can talk very loud about it, but I felt that there is some acceptance. And then yesterday it felt like, oh, like there is a big gap, because the views, it was very violent than before. Maybe because the act of her, because she commits suicide and she make a statement, a bigger statement, because she was persecuted and she was living in Canada and feeling very sad, because she was alone and she lost her mother and many things. But I felt also social media now, and especially in the time of COVID-19, it is very, it's become like a battle. Really, there is a real struggle every day in Egypt, in other countries, about any subject, about River Nile in Egypt. Also now with a problem with Ethiopia, there is very radical views about war from both sides, and this is also make me, yeah, I believe social media is very important, but this is the thing, what I feel now somehow.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. You are right. The platform itself, it's because it's this big melting pot where extremists, from every, you like red, you don't like red, you like black, you don't, but everybody can come together. And I think it's good. And it's good that we can hear lots of different sides. What the challenge is that if we don't manage it, then sometimes negative, harmful, racist comments, anti-gay comments come out. And I feel that that's where you have to decide whether you want freedom of speech, freedom of hateful speech, or what you want. And I think there are a lot of people discussing that right now, about whether you should shut people down or not. But what I do know is that is a far more, a better indicator of what's going on in people's minds than stuff that we read in papers. And I will just tell you this, that, Google Trends and Google surveys they tell you what the real zeitgeist, what people are really thinking is what they're searching for. Because, you ask people questions, they'll say, oh, no, I'm not this. But then they're really searching for things, and what's on people's minds. So I do feel, the digital social media is much more reflective. So if we can do narrative work around social media and try and guide people or introduce new storylines, and there are people that do that. So I do think you're absolutely right, Eda. It is absolutely critical. It's something that we can't ignore.
Okay, Carol Karamera from Rwanda has a question.
Yes, thank you for the conversation. I think you mentioned the one thing I think is really important, talking about the multiplicity of ways of storytelling. And also when we talk about the content and who is putting that content out for us. And my question is like, with Africa No Filter and maybe other people participating in this conversation, but how much loss of African narratives can we sustain? Because we are losing, as you said, storytellers, people capacity and even skills or diversity of ways that we say, that we tell storytelling every day. So how much can we sustain this? And talking about contemporary storytelling, the name of the organization I think is really interesting, No Filter. And how much festivals and artists are we responsible to tell stories of injustice, stories of so many issues that Africans are facing with no filter, and even though when we speak to young children. And the last one was how do you see that the question of Mike is how do we across Africa and forgetting for a while about the rest of the regions, I'm sorry, but how do we cross borders and views of the current situation of Africa and our societies, because it's really difficult, as you said, to reach what's going on in Southern Africa or Northern Africa, except if you follow some of few platforms that we have, like Chimurenga or Kwani, and you can have every 3 months access to news stories and ways of telling stories. Thank you.
So I think you've, thank you, Carol. I think you've asked 3 questions. I'm not sure, but the first one that I know was about sustainability of storytellers well, on the continent. Africa No Filter is going to try and address what it can. I mean, you know, we don't have enough money to uplift, elevate, and support all storytellers or creatives, but the work we are doing is around, you know, we will be doing a fellows program. We had one last year. We'll probably do that again. Our work is to try and amplify, you know, storytellers, to network them with each other. Research we got back from our storytellers last year was that, you know, the best bit about the fellowship was actually meeting other people in different countries in Africa and being able to collaborate with them. They just didn't get the opportunity to do that. So just networking them, we understood was critical. Also connecting them to markets, connecting them to opportunities for themselves. So, you know, there's you're an excellent writer, a young writer, but there's an amazing, you know, publisher here that's looking for fresh African voices. There's a festival here that would look to put your stuff on because you're an amazing young artist. So our thing is to try and connect them to markets. And also another key part is also trying to upskill them. So we're trying to figure out how we can make you a better writer, how we can help you market yourself better, because these are all ways to aid your ability to sustain yourself, because that's the key thing for us, that we're looking for, you know, I won't say systemic change, but if we just give you money and say, hey, go and do your installation or whatever, it's not short term, but it's not long term either. So I'm trying to look at what are the drivers that we need to shift to help creatives. And it is things like, you know, training, and it is things like connecting them and networking them, most importantly, connecting them to markets. That's your first question. I'm not sure that I got your second question, but it was about contemporary storytelling. I don't know if you want to tell me, but I can take your third point, which was about sort of how do we get each other to see each other on the continent? Is that right? Carol, was that right? Yeah. You know, one thing I realized, there are a lot of Pan-African platforms, and there is social media. Right? So all of these digital platforms know no borders. So if we had that interest in each other, I could tell you, I could find you in, you know, I don't know where you're sitting right now, but I could find you wherever you are. But the point I made earlier on is that we've got to stimulate that interest within ourselves as Africans, and that interest is not there. In the numbers, we need it to be there. So, you know, I'm a photographer, or, you know, I'm an artist sitting in Lagos, and I'm looking to see what the top artist in New York is doing because I want to go to New York and I want to go to Hollywood. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but until we make Africa the destination and we make that need to collaborate and that, you know, opportunity be in Africa, the few people that make it that are good are going to disappear from this continent, and that's what we're seeing already. They're going elsewhere to other markets. So Africa has to become sustainable for them. It's got to be enough that you release your movie on the continent and you make money from it. doesn't have to go to Hollywood. You know, there are all these things, but to your question, I think there are a lot of platforms already. We just need to have that interest to do it. And for someone like me who's interested in multiple countries, I find there's so many sources, so many things that are Africa this, Africa that. It's not just, you know, it's there if you want it, but you have to be interested in it. And I didn't get your second question. So.
Okay, and we've got 10 minutes left, so we're going to just go to a few other questions, Carol, and if there's time, we'll come back to Carol, who's sitting in Kigali at the moment. There's a question from Sigrid Yanara, and also just to mention that, Moky, if you can speak a little bit about, you know, there are people from festivals in a whole range of other countries that might want to have or have had relationships with African artists in the past or might want to have in the future. Do you play any role in that as Africa No Filter? But you can come back to that question after Sigrid.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. This is really inspiring. I'm from Colombia, and I would like to know, how do you imagine the cooperation with the African diaspora? Because we have some issues that are historical and will not put us together because of history. But we have, I can say that we have Africa in Colombia in a physical and touchable and evident way. It's not exactly my case now, but I can just give you a couple of pictures and you can find it. And there is a festival who is called Petronio Alvarez, who is unstoppable now, and is a window to see these excluded Colombians, Black Colombians. But there is still the wish of many of our people that wants to be not excluded anymore. So they wish to be more Africans, nowhere, everywhere, than Colombians. Yeah, they don't mind. They dress as Africans and they wish, and they have never trouble. But because the exclusion, this is the closest thing to us. So I every time imagine how could it be this diversity, diasporic cooperation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And one of the things we had with all the funders was whether or not we were going to include diasporans in our framing of Africa. And yes, you know, it's not about geographically, physically where you are. It's actually where you feel you are. So if you feel you're African, absolutely, you are part of the community who are mission aligned and want to make sure that the other sides, the other stories within Africa come out. You are part of our community. So this is not a, you know, you have to be based in Africa to benefit from any of the work that we're doing, because the work we are doing will benefit you wherever you are. But you have to have the right mindset, I think, because there's a lot of diasporans who, you know, don't connect with the continent anymore. They've gone and they're wherever, you know, whoever they are. So yes, diasporans who connect to the African continent and interested. And again, it goes back to that, you know, desire to know about the continent, desire to know your history, to know your story. It has to come from each individual. And I think that's where it doesn't matter where you are physically born. It's more about who you feel you are.
Thank you.
Maybe just to thank you very much, Sigrid. And the question I asked a little bit earlier, some of the festivals in Europe and elsewhere have been very frustrated by the fact that they may invite Africans to come and participate in the festivals, but it's always such an incredible hassle to get them there because of the visa processes. And even when they guarantee that they're going to pay for all of their costs or whatever, their embassies simply, you know, refuse them visas because as artists, they don't have bank accounts that show regular income. They don't own property. They don't show that they're going to return to their country. So there's fear that they are simply going to stay in Europe and become a burden financially and otherwise to those countries. So insofar as Africa No Filter is quite keen to project new narratives across the globe, that's obviously one of those challenges that would be put in the way of artists who seek to, you know, tell those new narratives. Are you going to play any kind of role with festivals, or can you play any kind of role with festivals to facilitate travel and mobility by African artists?
Oh, that's an easy question, Mike. Thank you for that one.
That's just to end, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's to your point about that sort of institutional kind of barriers for artists on the continent, because it's not even just traveling to a festival outside of Africa. For an artist to try and get to South Africa from Nigeria, it's bloody difficult.
Absolutely.
It's really hard.
Sure.
But where, I had to look at what is Africa No Filter best placed to do? What are the interventions that we're best placed to do? And that's potentially one of them. But again, we're fundamentally a grant-making organization. So it could be that, we're looking at how, if there's an advocacy organization that's looking to fundamentally increase the rights of artists. So things like the fact that you don't have enough money, regular income, does not mean that you are therefore a risk, a flight risk. You're going to leave the continent. So there must be organizations looking at that. And is that something Africa No Filter will get involved in at this stage? I don't know, because I don't know the volume of the problem. You probably hear once or twice that it's happening, but like you hear about it here, and it's not just for festivals, it's for even business people who've got jobs in their own countries can't get into other countries. And that's why countries like Rwanda have become almost the convening capital of the continent, because you can go there wherever you are. You don't need a visa if you're in Africa, or you can get a visa at the door. It's just become a country that's actually recognized and done something about that problem. And so they're introducing this, just for out of interest, there's going to be an African passport at some stage. They've been talking about it for a long time. I think there's a handful of influencers that have this passport. Maybe that's going to help within the continent, because again, like I keep saying, and I don't want to sound like I'm being nationalistic, but I just feel that if we can even move around within our own continent first, that's the step forward.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Moky. We have about 2 minutes left. I'm not sure if there's any further question from the group. Anybody? Or comment?
I have a question for anybody who wants to take it. Because of the work you guys do, you're probably just a lot more, you're open-minded and you think about things differently. I'm just curious about, when you think about Africa, do you think the things I've been saying about the narrative we're trying to shift, do they impact you? Do you think about it in any way? Or is this, oh, okay, I didn't realize that there was a narrative that needed shifting? Carol.
No, I'm not going to ask Carol. I want someone else to answer from another continent, because that's kind of what we are wanting to interface with right now. Thanks, Carol. We'll come back to you if we need to. For colleagues from other continents, you've been very quiet on this. There's Amira, there's Aaron. Aaron?
Well, I think the whole notion of rewriting the narrative is something that somebody who has worked also with artists from especially South Africa, about how we reflect on a continent like Africa is quite understandable. And it may relate to how we're trying to rewrite narrative connected to minorities living in our own societies, and creating a narrative where we try to, where we fight for more diversity on our national stages and in our films, and to also reflect the diversity of languages that are spoken in our cities that completely get disregarded. So I think that in as small pockets within our own artistic communities, we're trying to do it for African people living in our cities, or people from the Balkans living in our cities, like in Austria, or people from Asia. So I think we're aware of it, and of course, having someone who's traveled through Africa and met a lot of people, I understand that what we project, I guess it's more a project on that continent is completely different than once you are there and you see the people. And corrupt governments, we have enough in Europe also, and mismanagement, we are the masters of it. So it may have been imported to Africa by us, among other things. So I think the challenges we face are similar, just on very different levels. And of course, the biggest difference being the racist attitudes and money. as you said, I come from Austria, so we are lucky. We have money, even compared to other European countries that don't have this kind of opportunities that we have.
Right. Thanks, Aaron. Amira?
Well, thank you, Moky. I really loved what you say, and I relate because Yemen, like Africa, and I think it's really important to be our own witness to what is happening in our own countries, because what is happening in Yemen, if you follow the news, the problem with us that we always having like some kind of stereotypes. We are as stereotypes in the news, and the thing like in Europe or America, your media is really strong, and that is and sometimes it's not I don't know if we the local storytellers consider to be authentic or not, because what I see as a storyteller in Yemen, that some of the newspaper and magazine, they don't accept the local storytellers, but if they send one of their storytellers and he just works say 1 week or 1 month, and then later they're going to be getting awards for being in that risky place, blah blah blah. But the freelancer who work there, who get arrested, who finance herself, who it doesn't count. It doesn't count how many years you have been working. I have been working as 17 years, and the way I see how the media treating the local storytellers is different, and it doesn't hurt me so much, but not to be recognized as authentic, and to be like with the news, normally they are more trusting their own people, like someone they commissioned and paid. They go in mission, they pay them 40,000 euro to be in Yemen for 1 week or 1 month, whatever. So, and this is a problem for me, because I wish it's different. I wish we get treated differently.
Yeah, I think it might be something which quite often international funding is made available for artistic productions, provided it involves people from the country providing the funding as well as locals.
Yeah, it's true, but with the war in Yemen, I have been 6 years with no work, and now I have like huge amount of work with me, but now it's considered to be old, because it has been 2 years since I left Yemen after my arrest. So now I feel myself, I always wanted to be connected. I wanted to be in Europe or America so I can reach media and people in power and people who has the decision. I wanted a politician to wake up in the morning and read my news. So first year, like I success, it was in the National Geographic, the Washington Post, the Guardian, but now it's difficult. Like during the confinement, it's difficult for me to get the success of the last year, because my work now is so old. And this makes me realize in Paris that I need to start working, to start studying art. Maybe this is another approach, so my work gonna not be old, and I just invest more in my mind.
Okay, thanks, Amira. Moky, you want to make any comment? Maybe we're just about done, so I just want to read some of the closing comments on the one side here. Yaka wanted to know, are there specific tools used to shift narratives? Maybe that can be a conversation afterwards, and you can go to the website. And Carol, the creation of the first Indigenous theatre in Canada last year was an incredible step to give spaces to Indian American narratives to be told to the entire Canadian community, told, taught, and educate. Maybe that can be something that we end off with. You know, here in Africa, we have the Goethe Institute, the French Institute, the British Council, that are conduits for stories and narratives from those particular countries. Maybe, Moky, you need to be speaking to the African Union, and we should be having Africa centers in Paris, in Brussels, in London, that are sites and houses of culture where Africans can travel and exhibit at and basically showcase their work. So thank you
there is
very
one in
much.
New York. It's
There
called,
is one in
the
New
Africa
York, yeah.
Center, which was
That's
funded,
right.
I think, to the tune of $30 million by a Nigerian, billionaire. So yeah, slowly.
Sure. Okay, well, from my side, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Inge to say thank you to you. But from my side, thank you very much, Moky, for being part of this conversation. And thank you to everyone for your participation as well. Inge.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. Sorry, you want to finish?
No, I was just saying thank you to everybody for joining.
Great. Thank you so much, Moky, for doing this. When we first talked, she asked me, like, what will I have to say to these people and festivals, and how do you think it's related? And I think it has been such a delight to have you here. You touched so many issues which are relevant to our world as well. The fact of international mobility within the country, the fact of being self-reliant, so many issues on the level of sustainability, to go beyond polarization, the us and them, which brings us immediately also into the next keynote that we will have with the work of unity, which is such a strong image today in New York, where the protests are gathering around the work of Hank Willis Thomas, as well as the role of popular culture, which is something which Hank Willis Thomas is working around as well, to create stories around identity, history, and popular culture, to create a voice for Black people in the US. So really, you exceeded all expectations. Mike, thank you so much for facilitating this. So we will gather here again, also for the people who have followed the live stream, at 4 p.m. Central European Summer Time, at 10 a.m. in New York or Santiago Amil time, and in 10 p.m. in the evening for Perth, Oceania and Asia, Hong Kong time. So it was a pleasure. See you all later.